Hey everyone. I thought I would try to continue the line of exploration that I've been considering relative to the issue of metamodern Christianity, um, and try to pull together some threads. I just recently released a video called Metamodernism, Miracles and the Historical Jesus, in which I do a pretty thorough kind of deconstruction, you could say, of a particular historical accounting of the Gospels and what they're doing. And so I wanted to not just leave that in deconstruction, I wanted to bring that into a reconstructive mode to try to draw out the insights that exist in the historical, critical takeaways from the Gospels and the Jesus story. And if you watch that video and if you're familiar with, a lot of the stuff I'm trying to inject into the conversation around metamodern Christianity, you'll know that the kind of basic message there is that a lot of what is assumed to be true about Jesus in a historical manner is in fact not that, not what we might have thought was going on in those stories. And when I encountered that challenge, it was incredibly difficult for me. Um, Maybe more difficult than for others, given the sort of theological tradition which I was raised, which was very much about the literal um, kind of reading of the text and the assigning of the significance to a certain kind of historical accuracy. And given how deeply I'd gotten into apologetics, that had really kind of cemented that view that what the Gospels were doing was like history and it was better than history and it was the best accounting of reality that could be given along those terms. And so when I really went deep into the whole biblical studies, biblical scholarship, and historical critical mode on those stories, it was a radically different perspective I needed to integrate. And that produced a lot of cognitive dissonance and left me struggling with how to make sense of all that. So I want to say all that because I think, yeah, a number of folks maybe might have watched those videos that I put out and maybe are sitting with some of that. And I want to like honor that if that's the case. It could not be too, you know. I don't know what's going on for folks when they watch these sorts of things, but I just if that is the case, I wanted to like, draw attention to it as a way to identify with it and to give it its proper recognition as a moment. But I also wanted to meet that moment with an answer, with a response, with a there's something beyond this. Um, Whatever that moment is for people, and it might have nothing to do with history, it might have everything to do with questions of suffering, or it might have everything to do with a particular relationship that someone had to, someone in the religious tradition, or it might have everything to do with just some other kind of wrestling with this material. There's a moment of deconstruction that occurs in which the world you've been living in falls apart. And if you've been using the Gospels and the Christian narrative to make a world and you feel those to be undermined in some fundamental way, then your fundament will dissolve and you will be falling in space and questioning and doubtful and scared and angry and everything that goes along with experiencing a particular collapse of a world that you'd inhabited. And I wanted to speak to that for a second. Um, I frame all that in relation to these videos I've been putting out, just because that was a particular way that happened for me. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be any other form. There are many ways in which our worlds can fall apart. And um, what I want to suggest is that, hard as that experience might be, it's actually the seedbed, this fertile ground for something so much richer to emerge out of that. That there are worlds that we can rebuild out of the ashes, so to speak, from our prior worldviews that can be so much more enriching and empowering and beautiful and exciting. And that's why I think I tend to value so much kind of these developmental learning frames in metamodern conversations, because the process by means of which we construct worlds and then experience their deconstruction and then out of their ashes build something broader and more complete and more comprehensive is a story that I've experienced very profoundly multiple times, and specifically in relationship to traditional devotional forms of Christianity, that um, I want to speak to the positive aspect of that, of what comes out of that, and the promise that exists in those moments of regrowth and reconstruction and rebirth. And the argument that I want to make is that the Christian story is about that, that it can be read as being about that, that it includes in its own imagery and story and symbols a way of making sense of our own way of making sense. Um, so in these videos, I've been posting, talking about this difference between the sort of Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And I'm trying to make the argument that the Christ of faith is really a justified entity to relate to build a religious world on. What I'm trying to do is underscore how little the Christ of faith has to do with the historical Jesus. Um, and I'm trying to emphasize that if Christianity has a mode in the future that is particularly anti-fragile and robust, it is one in which the history of the person of Jesus of Nazareth is not the central focus, but rather the Christ of faith is the central focus that can exist in relationship to the historical Jesus in a manner that is complex, nuanced, sophisticated, maybe mystical, maybe harboring degrees of paradoxical, maybe set in a liminal sphere of uncertainty, any number of things, but that these exist as two modalities to which we can relate to that person of Jesus. Um, and that these are two significant modalities that we can simultaneously integrate and relate to in a way that is true to all of our experience. It's true both to our lived religious experience and to our intellectual propositional knowledge experience. That the ability to appreciate this conundrum might be kind of essential to appreciating aspects of what I'm imagining metamodern Christianity to be about. So, one of the things I've been trying to do over the course of these various videos I've been putting out is to inject the information about the modern historical critical perspective on Jesus into the conversation. Most folks will be familiar with the traditional devotional approach in that perspective. I want to put in the modern historical critical perspective. Another thing that I see people appreciating intuitively, but which I'd like to extrapolate a little bit from, is the postmodern perspective on these questions, which essentially says that as a critique of modernity, the modern lens does not offer us the ultimate vantage on these phenomena. And the reason for that is because the modern vantage is a vantage, it's a perspective. The traditional is also a perspective. And so the fact that we have multiple perspectives means something to us of significance. And it shows that neither of these can just be simply absolutized, but have to be taken as vantages, as perspectives, as lenses on Jesus. Now, a lot of that way of thinking over the past 30 years has tended in the direction of a relativism, which is to say, neither of these speak more or less to the quote unquote truth of things because all truths are situated in perspectives. And so there is nothing to adjudicate these different perspectives in relation to that wouldn't just be another perspective. And thence comes all of the skepticism and doubt and relativism of the postmodern frame. Now, a lot of what I see currently unfolding in some of these metamodern Christian conversations is to affirm half of that postmodern statement and say, yes, we do all come from perspectives and situated knowledge. And one of those can be the traditional. And if there is nothing to adjudicate any of the relative value of these different perspectives by, then let's work with the one that seems to give us, in many ways, the most fulfilling, valuable, meaningful perspective and reject the other. And that's a wonderful insight. And I would say that's the beginning of a particular metamodern move towards thinking beyond postmodernism. Because postmodernism, I guess, in the language of the Matrix, shows us the door, but then we enter through it. And we have to make of that situation what we'll make of it. The thing is, we can make of it many different things, and it matters a lot what sort of sense we make from the postmodern predicament of these various perspectives and what we choose and why. So I want to also acknowledge and honor that that is unfolding in some of this conversation, and I think that it's an important first step. And I want to contribute something to that process that I've seen play out in other aspects of the metamodern conversation that I feel like could help with some clarity around this step, which is that there is a certain way of relating to the relativism of perspectives in such a manner that shows that they are not arbitrary, but ordered in some kind of coherent relationship with each other, which doesn't reject or disagree with the notion that they are relative in a relational situation with each other, but it does cognize that that relationship is a progressive one in which you can find certain ordered patterns by which one perspective might relate to the other. If you can find certain ordered patterns by means of which one perspective relates to the other, then you're no longer in the radical relativism of postmodern perspectivalism. You've managed to use postmodern perspectivalism to gain a higher vantage on the situation, the meta situation to all these perspectives. And here's where metamodernism tries to enter that conversation and explore that possibility space. Because metamodernism would appreciate the postmodern insight that there are multiple perspectives, but it would try to situate those perspectives in relation to one another in such a way that you could very meaningfully show a set or pattern of relationships that holds amongst them, and therefore could begin to order the perspectives in such a way that you had a coherent vision from a higher vantage on perspectives themselves. You'd get a meta perspectival vision. And this, because it's working beyond the scope of simple relativistic perspectivalism, is a meta-perspectival view that can speak to that perspectival vision from a higher vantage. And in the same way that increasing dimensionality leads to a higher vantage on reality, so would this, right? From a third dimensional perspective, I can look down on a piece of paper and I can see what's going on from a sort of God's eye point of view from that perspective. And the two-dimensional figures within that perspective could not see me. So I have an advantage or a higher perspective. I have more of a perspective on the second dimension than the second dimension has on me. But of course, this logic continues. If there's a fourth dimension, they could hypothetically be looking down on me and be seeing more of my horizon than I am capable of, and so on and so forth. And this is the sort of logic that we're working with here. If you can gain a meta perspective on a particular context, you're able to see more of that context from your vantage than those embedded in it. Now, what metamodernism would attempt to or claim to do is gain that meta perspective that can look down on these other perspectives and find a certain form of informational coherency that is over and above what the embedded perspectives themselves have access to. Now, given that metamodernism situates itself over and above postmodernism, metamodernism would claim an advantage over and above postmodern relativistic perspectivalism, which is to say, how do these perspectives relate to one another and interact and have a sort of coherent pattern or logic to them? And a lot of the insights of a lot of everything that I've said comes from folks like Habermas and Ken Wilber and other folks exploring constructive responses to the postmodern. Now, the insight of this vantage is in being able to look at the different lenses that we become aware of in the postmodern frame. Because postmodernism introduces us to the fact that we are looking through lenses on the world. What's interesting, though, is that you can step back from the postmodern and see the postmodern according to its own logic, which is as a lens on lenses. But if you can get a lens on the lens of lenses, then you're able to gain a higher vantage on the whole issue of there being lenses. And you can begin to ask second order questions about lensing in the same way that someone who might spend their life looking through a pair of glasses can take off those glasses, assess them, and realize that they're working with a pair of glasses. But they can also try on a bunch of different lenses and different glasses and come to an appreciation of the meta issue of seeing what it means to see through different lenses. And that's something that postmodernism, in its kind of classic articulation, hadn't had an opportunity to explore because it was just beginning to grapple with the issue that all knowledge is situated and contextualized. Now that we're able to reflect on those reflections, we're able to gain meta-level reflections on these kinds of reflections. We're able to get a perspective on perspective taking. And when you do that, there are certain insights that it affords you. And this is the way in which, or a way in which, metamodern thought, influenced by its inheritance from integral and other sources, is able to find a new level or vantage on the insights of the postmodern. And I'll try to unpack a little bit what those are and how they relate to Christianity. If you're working from this perspective and you're working from the issue of perspectives themselves, you're ultimately able to gain a sense of the coherent order that exists in perspectives themselves, meaning you get a logic or a system of the systems that postmodernism describes. So, what are some of the systems that postmodernism describes? Well, one is modernity itself in that particular lens, which it critiques and names as a lens and tries to situate within a broader context of lenses to drive home the point. So then, in contrast to the modern perspective, is the pre-modern perspective, from which originally modernity tried so hard to disentangle itself and define itself against. So there's the pre-modern lens and the modern lens. Both of those are operating. And we can see them trying to distinguish their elements of reality in relationship to one another. Now, the postmodern is recognizing this phenomenon and it's drawing these distinctions and it's saying, who is the modern to question the pre-modern? What means does it use to adjudicate why it is so powerful and better than any other perspective? In the process, though, it's taking a perspective on the modern and the pre-modern. The metamodern steps back from this situation and says, isn't that what the postmodern is doing? Taking a perspective on the perspective of the modern and the pre-modern. And so we have a new perspective, one that includes the postmodern, the modern, and the pre-modern from the vantage of a metamodern perspective. From this advantage, from this perspective, the whole relationship of postmodern to modern to pre-modern and so on is taken into view. And from this vantage, certain relationships can begin to be analyzed and assessed and intuited and explored about this perspectival relationship. And with enough material or a data set, you could say, to work with in terms of the number of perspectives involved, it can begin to chart certain kinds of linear relationships amongst them. What's interesting, however, is that the development of linear relationships is themselves part of what it is assessing and drawing a linear relationship through. Meaning, the modern perspective is where the concept of linear relationality really gains prominence. And the postmodern is an extenuation of the scientific project to try to isolate from its ken those particular local biases that might infringe upon or in other ways impact the findings that it concludes, which is to say that the postmodern is a continuation of the modern scientific impetus by reflecting on the scientific impetus itself. And when you see all this occurring, you're able then to chart a linear trajectory from the pre-modern into the modern into the postmodern as a progressive development of a particular idea, which is what? Which is each one of these stages is trying to get a reflective vantage on the previous stage in order to understand it, differentiate itself from it, and learn more about the nature of itself, where it comes from, where it's going. And in this way, the modern is able to eventually reflect on the pre-modern, get its sense of the pre-modern as an object of analysis, reflect on it, critique it, and identify itself in the mixture of all of that. And in the process, it's able to come up with certain criteria for understanding the failures of certain kinds of pre-modern sense-making, specifically limited to issues of local bias, particularization, and the dominance of a given perspective to color its perceptival information processing in such a way through its own lens that it's not able to see more of the picture. And that's what science, of course, attempts to correct for by all the mechanisms and procedural methodologies that would attempt to remove the observer from the observed in that third person perspective. What's interesting about that is that as that process unfolds, it, yes, distances itself from the pre-modern perspective, which was not able to do that to the same degree, but in the process ultimately reaches a kind of radicalization of that project, such that it takes that project itself into its ken as an object of awareness and study and reflection, and is able to apply the same logic to that in order to further and develop the project. And that is what postmodern contextualization and the relativization of thought structures is in its best forms doing. Because it's able to situate then uh, the scientist in their attempt to situate observers and knowers in their contexts. And therefore, it's able to gain a second level remove from even the scientific vantage in a way that ultimately reveals information to the scientist that the scientist was unaware of. What sorts of information might have scientists been unaware of is what is my particular race? What is my particular ethnicity? What country do I operate in? What are the particular social dynamics in which I am operating? What are the particular geopolitical dynamics that are influencing the sorts of ways that I am able to conduct myself and my research, or the kinds of funding that I'm getting to do my research, and what are the interests of the funders, and so on and so forth. Which is to say, the very object of science, which is to distance the observer from the observed in a way that can speak to sort of objective truth, is itself a project that becomes the subject, or the object of awareness to a postmodern reflector who's able to take all of that phenomena into their ken and reflect on it and critique it for its own shortcomings relative to its own insights, which is the need to observe the observed with as little imposition from the lens of the observer as possible. And that is one of the crucial insights of the postmodern move, able to stand back from and reflect on that. Now, of course, you can then begin to imagine this process repeating itself as a pattern, so that one could, hypothetically, become aware of the postmodern move recursively reduplicating a particular reflective move on the modern and seeing that that's the same move that the moderns did on the pre-moderns, and then begin to discover this as a recursive pattern. This would be the notion of the meta-modern. I've made this argument in my book, uh, Metamodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics, which tries to put the meta in metamodern, which is to say, owning this recursive, self-reflective move as being something that can provide us a new insight on the progression of thought itself. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that once you identify that this is a pattern, you can start to understand that history itself has been unfolding according to this pattern in terms of the logic and knowledge that gets produced in history at any given moment, such that if you look at the production of knowledge over time, you can see an unfolding in which increasingly across the chronological span, there is a uptick in the level of recursive reflection unfolding across the different epochs, which means that the move identified by the postmoderns is right, but it needs to be recursively fractalized, right, into a pattern to knowledge construction itself. And here, again, I'm drawing insights from the integral framework and from the influences that it draws from learning theory, Piagetian thought, hierarchical complexity, and so on, which identifies this recursive move as being central to the learning process itself. And hopefully you can begin to understand then why one would want to interpret, or see if they could interpret, the unfolding of history in terms of the logic of a learning process. So hopefully what I've suggested so far that you're beginning to intuit is that the metamodern move is one that develops upon the postmodern move, which of course itself is only just beginning to develop upon the modern move, which is this particular sort of recursive self-reflection upon what has been before and the objectivization of that and the critique of it and the attempt to become aware of more of the information in their environment that should be brought to bear on their sense making and their relevance realization, you could say. So, if this is something going on in this meta modern move, then you could begin to see that the appreciation of patterns in the unfolding of human consciousness becomes a central concern. Is that the means by which we are able to learn that can legitimately shown to successively and progressively unfold and accrete on themselves would be the basis for beginning to adjudicate amongst the plurality of perspectives that the postmodern frame brings to our attention, which is to say, how can we relate perspectives in such a manner that one follows to the next in a demonstrable fashion, and even in a logical sort of fashion? How could you relate the modern to the postmodern and beyond, maybe, in such a way that one seemed to follow upon the other in such a way that it was able to successively build upon the previous limitations and expand the scope of the other in relation to this recursive process of expanding and shifting the frame into higher dimensional levels, you could say, of information processing. Now, all of that sounds maybe very arcane and complex, but hopefully it's starting to land in an intuitive way as a process of self reflection and development of sort of the tree rings that expand one upon the other by building upon the other and then simultaneously leading into something new. Now, this is what the metamodern frame uses to apply to perspectives and see a certain kind of development or unfolding amongst those perspectives. And one of the chief ways it does this is through the lens of complexification. The more layers in the tree that you can nest into a particular layer will tell you how old and developed that layer is. If you have 60 tree rings in your layer, that layer is more developed than the layer where there's only 5. And you can begin to see this accretive, self-growing process underway in reality. So if the modern depends on the pre-modern and the postmodern depends on the modern and the metamodern depends on the postmodern, you can begin to frame this as a kind of holarchy, as the integral framework talks about it, something that transcends and includes what came before and builds on what came before. And I think a lot of that framing is very enlightening and illuminating about what a metamodern frame is trying to do. You'll also appreciate that in all of that, somehow that would presume that we are including the pre-modern and the modern and the postmodern in a metamodern perspective. But not like the postmodern, we're not just seeing all of these existing simultaneously in some sort of open field on the same plane. We're able to situate them all relative to each other in a particular logical relationship that can identify trends and patterns in the very unfolding of perspectives and the very law that can allow you to situate those perspectives one to the other is the dynamic of perspective unfolding itself, which is to say, how many layers of recursive self-reflection can I include in myself in such a way that these are related in a manner that includes what came before, builds upon it, but also gains new information about the vantage in which that perspective was generated and try to incorporate more. That's a certain meta pattern that the meta modern perspective brings to the unfolding of perspectives. And what I would now like to suggest is a way in which we can tie this back ultimately to the Christian perspective. to the perspective whose traditions and symbols and imagery stems from a pre-modern layer, gets developed and explored and deconstructed in its own historical fashion in a modern layer, and then further that layer getting deconstructed through the lens of postmodern analysis to appreciate a metamodern perspective in which all of those are participating in part of an unfolding flowering that has occurred through history, to appreciate all of that in such a way that ties back to the pre-modern Christian imagery itself is what I'd attempt to do in this brief video right now. And the way I'd like to try to make that connection is to suggest that the directionality of this process that's been unfolding from perspective to perspective to perspective, that directionality is defined relative to the direction in which it is tending. It is gesturing towards something. It has a trajectory. The pattern, the order, the logic, the equation, the algorithm, whatever you want to call it, that is abstractable from this process has a kind of itself linear unfolding in a particular direction. The aim of that direction, the telos, to use a philosophical term, the goal, the bullseye to which this projectile of reality itself is on the way, I'd like to suggest that that is what has been called Christ consciousness. You could just simplify that and say that it's Jesus Christ, that it's the Christ of faith. Now, that's a lot to unpack as an idea. But what I'd like to suggest is that the Christ of faith is a symbol or an icon for the ultimate realization of history and the ultimate culmination of reality. Now, there are already folks who have spoken in these sorts of terms. The priest, Teilhard de Chardin, has written books about this, which he didn't publish in his own lifetime because he knew that they would be deemed heretical by the Catholic Church and allowed them to be published posthumously. But others as well. And the influence that that vision of Teilhard in our own modern time has been coming to a kind of flourishing moment in recent years, in such a way that many contemporary academics, scientists, complexity thinkers have been profoundly influenced by his vision. Bobby Azarian, in his book, The Romance of Reality, reflects very positively on the vision of Teilhard. And of course, Bobby's mentor and teacher, Harold Morowitz, was influenced. And this goes back some generations now to early complexity thinkers who in various ways have found some kind of relationship to that teleological vision, which in Teilhard's sense is a Christological vision, or what he calls the Christogenesis of reality. That reality is an unfolding evolutionary event that leads to the flowering of Christ in the ultimate realization of the eschatological telos of reality, which is the direction in which everything is tending. Even recent writers like Terence Deacon and David Sloan Wilson have explored versions of this way of thinking with specific inspiration from Teilhard de Chardin. But this whole way of thinking is part of a much broader theological vision, which has been extended upon by various geniuses throughout the 20th century, including folks like Whitehead, including other visionaries who relate the processual dynamics of reality to a particular Christian theology. And there's a good reason for thinking that way, because the very notion of some kind of linear aspect to history is in many ways the innovation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Much of the ancient world thought in terms of cyclical history, uh, and the very notion of a linear direction to history and the sacralization of the literal direction of history is a legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. You could draw a very direct line from Christian theology and the notion of sacred history to the development of the conception of evolution and the linear unfolding of a thermodynamic reality that has an arrow of time. And that all of this can be appreciated deeply by metamodern Christians. It can be appreciated as a further continuation of what in traditional devotional contexts is talked about as the revelation of God. The revelation of God in the traditional devotional perspective is about the speaking of the divine reality into historical time in such a way that it informs historical time and shows it the fact that it is part of a divine drama unfolding in existence, leading in a particular direction, comparable to the way that a story in a book has a beginning and an end, that God is the Alpha and the Omega, that there is a genesis and a revelation to existence. There is a particular way in which the perspectives of time can be related to one another in such a way that there is a pattern to their unfolding. And in this sense, we can begin to situate the progressive revelation that is Christianity itself in terms of a logical patterned relationship of perspectives through time, one to the other. Which is to say, as I've discussed briefly in another video, that the relationship of God to man and the reality of the divine drama, its understanding, can be understood as certain perspectives or interpretations from the human standpoint, and therefore versions of mind, of the human mind, that have been unfolding into each other over the course of history, such that you get an early tribal patriarchal sense of the relationship to the divine, yielding to a developed agricultural kingdom state in the nation of ancient Israel, and the monarchy developed into a monarchic temple complex cultic relationship with the deity that unfolds further into the axial age as the deepening of the interior and the moral and the conceptual and the cosmic notions of the divine. And this ultimately blossoming in the early Renaissance and onward into the Enlightenment and modernity itself as a deeper realization about the individual self and soul and the interior of reality, the feelings and the inner world and the inwardness, as Kierkegaard would call it, and all of this developing further into the deepening understanding of rational thought and causal relationship that ultimately continues, as I said earlier, into the postmodern as a radicalization of all of that, as an appreciation of more and more of the individual and the particular, and the radical plurality of possible conscious states and perspectives that can exist. And now we begin to see the pattern unfolding. The pattern has been one of expansiveness and the moving away of small parochial perspectives towards more accommodation to other perspectives and perspectival reflections themselves, the awareness of perspectives, the awareness of your own perspective, the awareness that there's more information that bears upon your understanding of reality than what you'd baked into your model or equation, and therefore a honing of the sensitivity of science itself and how sensitive we should be to the observer effect, which ultimately, of course, realizes its radical state in the observer effect of quantum physics, such that scientific and in some ways the postmodern begin to bump up next to each other in the realization that somehow reality in its most fundamental way seems to be related to by that which would understand it in a manner that we're still trying to understand and figure out. And that this is the pattern that the metamodern integrative perspective gives us access to. And if we understand this pattern as being unfolding along a trajectory in a direction, which is to say, increasing along a particular scale of something, and when we name that something as increasing numbers of nested perspectives, increasing amount of information processed about the self in relation to reality, if we understand that as the ability to decenter from your own lens enough to be able to appreciate the plurality of many, many other perspectives and to actually form a meta perspectival lens on lenses, if we're able to do all that and see the trajectory in which all that tends, we can hypothesize a future state in which this trajectory reaches its own maximal state, that the thermometer, as it were, reaches 100 degrees, or that the ruler has reached its end, which isn't either to say that there is an end to the process, but that we can begin to imagine the maximum of whatever this axis is, this perspective taking possibility axis. We can begin to imagine the prospect of the infinite perspectival perspective, the infinite perspective taking perspective. We can begin to conceive of the possibility, even if we can't actually enter that space, of what it might mean to be the nth degree, which is to say, we have a notion of what dimensionality itself now is, and we can imagine for the first time that particular axis of dimensionality being maximalized to the infinite. That presents us with a vision or an orientation that we can use to meaningfully speak about what the traditions have called God, to the degree that God is that telos of existence, and to the degree that God is the maximal state of existence. Now, I'll qualify this briefly relative to a conversation I recently had with Layman Pascal to say that there's something beyond what I'm talking about right now. But we might have to go through what I'm talking about right now to get there. So bear with me a little bit, because in some ways, what I'm talking about right now will itself need to be deconstructed and relativized. But we can't get there until we've gotten here. So, where is here? Here is the apex of reality being Christ consciousness. Christ, the Christ of faith, represents the imaginal image, symbol, person to which we can relate, that gestures us in the direction of that maximal state. This isn't just a theological reading divorced from theology. It's given some credence from the text itself, which is to say that when Jesus shows up in the Gospels, the bulk of his ministry gains its sort of theological traction through the conflict with more legalistic and parochial conceptions of the divine. The message of Jesus is in many ways a radical challenge to the existing religious authorities, precisely because it offers a vision of the divine that is more expansive than theirs. The divine that Jesus finds in first century Palestine is a rather narrow conception that has many legalistic presuppositions attached to it, and which is in many respects judgmental, legalistic, harsh, dominating, close-minded, and limited. And one can acknowledge all those things about that particular moment in that particular God concept without saying anything about rabbinic Judaism or the development of Judaism as a religion more broadly. This isn't a matter of Christian mercy and insight meets the closed-mindedness of ethnic Judaism or anything like that. That's a very limited perspective on all of this, and one within a very unfortunate history. The fact is, all religious traditions go through these stages, and Judaism itself has evolved towards Christ consciousness. Though you can begin to see why many perspectives are necessary to talk about these sorts of things, because that's a very condescending and patronizing and colonializing and appropriating way of speaking about the insights of modern Judaism, to call it Christ consciousness. We can't reduce these things ultimately then to particular religious traditions. We have to see beyond the religious traditions that they are gesturing towards. We have to see that secularity itself owes so much to this development of Christ consciousness. We have to see that Christ consciousness might itself need to be explored and expanded beyond the terms of Christ, which again points us in the direction towards a deconstruction of those things that we find most world building and valuable. Now, to the degree that different religions are justified in existing in their particular religious imagery and symbolic traditions, there's no need to reject the language of Christ consciousness or the notion of Christ. And in fact, I would say just the opposite, that a metamodern Christianity is that which embraces emphatically the Christian tradition and its symbols in order to speak to this cosmic process unfolding in the complexification of nature and the complexification of our psyches. The point I would like to make is that metamodern Christianity seeks and finds a relationship with that Christ of faith, with the form of consciousness that we can imagine as gesturing towards the more open, the more loving, the more embracing perspective. That this is what the gospel was about. This is why the gospel attracted millions of people and ultimately took over broad swaths of the world, because this idea, this insight was so powerful and so real that it had a power to change the course of history. At the same time, we can begin to see the convergence upon this kind of idea also amongst the other world religions in such a way that we can begin to abstract from the notion of Christ consciousness something even more expansive, less rooted in a particular tradition and more global and universal. All of this speaks to a conception, though, that thought progresses, that learning occurs, and we are able to expand upon our previous thinking into new domains of thought and new forms of more comprehensive universal perspectives. If this is the case, and I want to make the argument that it is, then we have to appreciate that our very forms of relating to God, to the divine, to Jesus, are subject to this process. If God is this process, and if Christ represents the goal to which this process is headed as a continual expansion of thought, then in the most wonderfully ironic of ways, entirely fitting with the logic of the Gospels, our God has to die in order for us to find the truth on the other side of the empty tomb. That our way of thinking needs to be sloughed off at any given moment to be transcended for a higher way of thinking. That our relationship to God can be parochial, limited, and narrow. And in fact, based on all that I've said, we should expect that at any given moment, our best reflection upon or understanding of the divine is but a hollow and very diminished form of whatever the truth might really be. And if we're going to get closer to that truth as it really is, we must ourselves undergo a process of continual transformation and change to, you could say, purify our thought and our understanding, such as to become closer in its correspondence with that ideal form. And if we take seriously that the goal or telos is the maximally open, expansive, loving, embracing, integrating perspective, then we are confronted by all of the limitations of our God concept that does not radically live up to those expectations. As a result, any form of the deity that we hold to that places demands upon and restrictions upon, has provisos and limitations and conditions, any notion that we might cling to about theological conceptualizations that neatly tie all the bows and fit into a particular worldview that seems to have everything covered, any sense of our deep comfort in the God concept that we adore needs to be disrupted. Because they are idols. At the same time, because of our incapacity to, in F. Scott Fitzgerald's terms, this side of paradise, have a sense of what that reality of the divine is, we have to appreciate that all of our possible God concepts and images and forms are idols, that all religion is idolatry, that doesn't emphasize the role of the icon. And the role of the icon is as an image which owns its own falsehood. An icon is an image of the divine that speaks to and about the divine by saying emphatically that it is not the divine. An icon is that which you look through, not at. An icon is a picture of God by being very loudly a picture of something else. And all our forms of religion, at best, are icons that can point us towards the truth through which we should look towards an unrealized, as of yet, imaginal aim or telos to existence that can orient us towards reality without showing us that reality. I think the importance of appreciating this is in radically relativizing all our forms of religiosity. It tells us that we need to stop taking ourselves so seriously, stop taking our theology so seriously. It tells us that there's so much more. And if you know that you don't know, as Socrates realized, then you know more than most. And it reconceptualizes the religious theological project. It's not being about what you get right. It's not being about capturing the ultimate truth of reality. That stuff isn't possible. And in fact, because our perspectives keep shifting, we can count upon the reality that a higher vantage can always be gained on what came before that will radically relativize and destabilize our previous perspective. That, though, is the doings of the divine, the action of the divine upon our psyche is to disrupt it, break it down, and offer us the chance to transcend and transform what we knew into something higher and bigger. And if we orient ourselves relative to that, we're in much better shape than clutching to any particular perspective as the truth, as our idol. And the takeaway then that I'd want to suggest is that the metamodern perspective offers this pattern as something to reflect upon, as a as an aspect of reality, and therefore as a dynamic in which also the divine is participating. And if the message or the takeaway is that the only thing solid and enduring is this creative, dynamic force moving through reality and history in such a way that it disrupts and transfigures everything, then at the same time, our understanding of reality is both exploded and fundamentally grounded in this kind of Heraclitean dynamism. The spirit moves where it pleases. And those who would look for a form of the divine untethered to naturalistic law, those who would seek the same kind of passionate will and unpredictability that we find in other persons, might have some comfort in appreciating how reality itself seems to zigzag into chaotic new realms of opportunity and abandon in such a way that we might glimpse the backside of God as he passes. And God's movement is the unfolding evolution of God into and as reality. And we are invited to participate in that unfolding. To whatever degree we find ourselves situated to give voice to or express the next moment in the divine unfolding, to whatever degree we feel inspired to write a word or sing a song or tell a tale that gets at some new aspect of the divine. And this is the last thing I'll say for now, because it leads into a whole realm that is certainly even more controversial and demanding of those who would engage Christianity from a metamodern lens and perspective. Because all of this points to an unfolding, changing, evolving sense of God that is occurring in culture and history as sacred history in continuity with a process that goes back to the very origins of time, in which is moving through our time and our moment, in which your actions contribute and participate. And if that is so, then the sum total of historical reality unfolding now relates to and is open to the developmental shift in the God of Christianity as God is moving through reality and history towards the next level in our understanding of him. I think that's where I'll leave that. I don't know if any of that made sense to anyone. Uh, Let me know if it did. Godspeed.